You know that feeling when you realize the person you love was never quite who you thought they were. That moment when the whole beautiful structure of what you believed collapses and you find yourself standing in the rubble, trying to work out which parts were ever real. That's the feeling Kit Beaton lived in for the better part of a year, and the cruelest thing about it, the thing that still keeps him up some nights, is that somewhere buried inside all the deception, the love actually was real, for one of them anyway. This is the story of a deal made in desperation, a romance built on a lie, and a betrayal so deep it might as well have been engineered. Because, as it turned out, it had been. Pull up a chair. Let's start at the very beginning. It's a Wednesday in late October, Portland, Oregon. The rain is doing what Portland rain does, persistently, relentlessly, like a quiet reminder that summer is gone for good, and isn't coming back until it's good and ready. Kit Beaton sits at a corner table in a coffee shop on Northwest 23rd Avenue. He is 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that tends to go unreadable when he's thinking hard. He's nursing his second Americano and staring at a text message from his mother that reads, "Your grandmother arrives Friday. She's expecting to meet the woman you mentioned in your letter. Please don't disappoint her, Christopher." Christopher, his full name. His mother only used full names when she was managing something that required composure. Kit's full name was Christopher Brady Beaton, heir, though he disliked that word, to Beaton Architectural Group, a mid-sized but highly regarded Pacific Northwest firm that his grandfather, Gerald Beaton, had built from a single drafting table in a rented studio in 1968. The Beatons were the kind of family who had opinions about everything: your career, your haircut, the typeface you chose for your business cards, and especially your romantic life. They expressed these opinions at high volume over very long dinners, and they expressed them because they loved you, which made it simultaneously easier and harder to endure. Kit loved them. He also found them exhausting in a way that only people who love you too much can be exhausting. The letter his mother had mentioned had been a mistake. 3 weeks earlier at his cousin Corinne's engagement party in Eugene, after one bourbon too many and one too many pointed questions from relatives about when he was going to settle down, Kit had sat at a writing desk in Corinne's guest room and written to his grandmother. His grandmother was Eleanor Beaton, Nana Bay to everyone who knew her, 83 years old, resident of a retirement community in Sedona, Arizona, and very sharp. In the letter, he had let slip that he had met someone special. The phrase had come out of him the way impulsive truths do, suddenly, without premeditation, more wish than fact. He hadn't met anyone special. He'd been working 12-hour days on a mixed-use development project in Lake Oswego, and hadn't been on a date in 4 months. But the bourbon and the collective Beaton pressure, his cousin's radiant, infuriating happiness, had conspired to produce those words. He'd sealed the envelope before he could think better of it. Now Nana B was flying in from Sedona to meet this person. She had arranged it all herself without asking first, because she was Nana B, and she didn't ask anyone's permission. Kit had approximately 48 hours to produce a girlfriend from thin air. He was still staring at the text, calculating exactly how badly a lie of this magnitude could grow when the chair across from him scraped back and someone sat down without being invited. "You look like a man with a problem," she said. Kit looked up. The woman was perhaps 30, maybe 31. She had close-cropped natural hair, dark brown skin, and eyes that processed information the way cameras do, fast, exact, and taking in more than they let on. She wore a charcoal blazer over a cream blouse and carried herself with the kind of posture that suggests either extensive ballet training or a very demanding mother. She had set a flat white folder on the table in front of her and was looking at him with an expression that was curious without being intrusive. "I'm sorry," he said. "You've been staring at your phone with that same expression for 22 minutes. I was at the counter." She nodded toward the espresso bar. "I counted. I'm Odessa Ziller." He shook her offered hand, slightly baffled by the whole interaction. "Kit Beaton, do you make a habit of sitting down with strangers?" "Only the ones who look like they need an interruption." She tilted her head. "So? What's the problem?" He laughed despite himself. It was the laugh of a man surprised out of his own head. "You wouldn't believe me if I told you. I've been told I have an unusually high threshold for the unbelievable. Try me." And he did. He told her about the letter, about the bourbon, about Nana Bay landing in 48 hours expecting to meet a woman who didn't exist. He told her because she was a stranger and he was desperate, and sometimes those two things together are enough to make a person confess anything. He told her and waited for her to laugh or to excuse herself politely, or to give him the look that said, "That's your problem, not mine." She didn't do any of those things. She sat back, folded her hands on the table, and looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, almost considering, as if running calculations he wasn't privy to. "What if I helped you?" she said. "Help me how?" "Play the girlfriend for the visit, a few days, maybe a week. I'm good at reading people. I adapt quickly, and I have no problem with a little performance when the situation calls for it. Kit stared at her. You're a complete stranger. You just told me your most embarrassing family secret in a coffee shop on a Wednesday afternoon. I'd argue we're practically friends. He laughed longer this time. Why would you do that? Genuinely. What's in it for you? She paused half a second, maybe less. I have family pressure of my own. My parents have been persistent about my social life. If I can go home and tell them I've been seeing someone seriously, an architect, from an established family, clearly not a disaster, it buys me some breathing room. We both get something out of it, clean transaction. It sounded logical, symmetrical even. A deal between two people who happen to have compatible problems, solved with a tidy exchange of convenience. Kit should have asked more questions. He should have wondered why a woman who carried herself with a quality of self-possession would need a fake boyfriend to satisfy her parents. He should have pressed on what family pressure meant, specifically. He should have noticed the pause, that small half-second gap between his question and her answer, the kind of gap that people leave when they're choosing a version of the truth. He didn't. He was desperate, and she was clever. Plus, the answer fit the problem too neatly to examine. Okay, he said, and held out his hand. Deal. She shook it with a firm grip, a professional handshake. The smile she gave him was warm and real and reached most of the way to her eyes. Most of the way. Nana Bay arrived on Friday at 2 in the afternoon in a cloud of Chanel No. 5 and luggage that was considerably more voluminous than a 4-day trip required. She came through the arrivals gate at PDX, moving at a pace that defied both her age and her rolling carry-on, spotted Kit and Odessa standing together at the barrier, and stopped. She looked at Odessa for a long moment. Odessa looked back calmly, without flinching. Oh, said Nana B. Well, she's lovely. From Eleanor Beaton, this was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Odessa had prepared. This was the first thing Kit noticed over dinner that evening at his parents' house in Lake Oswego. She had done her research. She knew that Nana Bia had met Kit's grandfather at an architecture conference in Seattle in 1961. She knew that Kit's father, Edward, had expanded the firm into sustainable residential design in the late 90s after a period of contention with the board. She knew that the firm's most celebrated project, the Larkspur House development on the Tualatin River, had been Gerald Beaton's last major commission before he retired. She knew things Kit hadn't told her, and at one point he caught her eye across the table and raised his brows just slightly, and she gave him a small, composed smile and turned back to his grandmother without breaking her conversational stride. The Larkspur House project, Odessa was saying, addressing Nana Bay directly with the ease of someone who had spent time learning to speak to specific people rather than rooms full of them. I came across it in a Pacific Northwest design journal a few years back. The way the buildings track the contour of the riverbank, it's obvious the designer loved the land, not just the structure. Most architects solve for the site. Whoever designed Larkspur listened to it. Nana Bay set down her fork. It was the deliberate kind of setting down, the kind that precedes something important. That was Gerald's last major project before he retired, she said. My husband. She looked at Odessa steadily. You did your homework. I wanted to understand where Kit comes from, Odessa said simply. At the end of the table, Kit's mother exchanged a look with his father that said, simultaneously, where has she been all this time? And I'm not going to say it, but I'm thinking it very loudly. After dinner, when Kit walked Nana B to the car that was taking her to her hotel, his grandmother took his arm and said quietly, She's not what I expected. What were you expecting? Someone sweeter, easier, the kind of woman who agrees with everything. She patted his arm. This one has a spine, the kind of spine that's been tested. She paused. Don't let her go, Christopher. He thought about that on the drive home, Odessa quiet beside him in the passenger seat, both of them exhaling from the performance of the evening, in the easy way of people who have just survived something together. The city lights moved across the windshield, and neither of them spoke for a while. You were good in there, he said finally. We were good, she corrected. She turned to look out the window at the rain beginning on the glass. Your grandmother is remarkable. She's the kind of person who makes you want to be better than you are. She liked you? I liked her. She paused, then said, That part wasn't a performance. It was the first time either of them had used that word aloud. Performance. An acknowledgement, glancing and unsettled, that some parts might be, while others might not. The visit was supposed to be 4 days, then Nana B extended it to a week, then 10 days. Because she hadn't come all this way to spend it in a hotel room, she intended to see the city, and she expected Odessa to show it to her, so Odessa did. She took Nana B to Powell's books and spent 2 hours helping her navigate the architecture section, finally locating a specific biography of Frank Lloyd Wright that Nana B had been after for a year. She took her to the Japanese garden in Washington Park on a Tuesday morning, when the crowds were thin and the maples were doing their autumn accounting leaf by leaf. She took her to Ristretto Roasters and introduced her to single-origin Ethiopian coffee, which Nana Bay declared better than anything in Sedona, though that's not saying much. And on a bench in the Japanese garden in the rain under a shared umbrella, Odessa sat beside Nana Bea and listened. About Gerald, about the early years when the firm had been a dream that ate into every paycheck and tested every nerve. About what it meant to build something you believed in, and then watch it become bigger than you, take on a life you hadn't imagined, outlast your own involvement in it, and about what it felt like to love a person for 51 years. Odessa listened with the genuine attention of someone whose interest wasn't tactical, but human. She asked questions, remembered answers. She came back to them in later conversations in a way that told Nana B she'd been heard. Kit watched all of this. He watched from a distance, from nearby tables, from across rooms. He watched a woman he'd hired to perform a relationship do something that wasn't in any script he'd written. He watched her be real with his grandmother, and he felt, with the helplessness of someone who can see exactly what is happening to them and cannot stop it, that he was falling in love with her. On the 9th evening, after Nana B had retired early with her Frank Lloyd Wright biography, Kit and Odessa sat on his back porch with wine they weren't really drinking and the rain starting again in the dark garden. "When does this end?" he asked. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The arrangement. She leaves day after tomorrow. I assume you go back to your regular life. I go back to mine. We shake hands, and that's that." Odessa held her glass in both hands and looked out at the wet garden for a long time. "I've been thinking about that," she said. "And—" she paused longer than her pauses usually were. "Maybe it doesn't have to end." He looked at her. She was still looking at the garden. "As a continued arrangement," he said, carefully testing the shape of it, "or as something else." The words came out quiet, like someone choosing them carefully. "I'm not entirely sure which one I mean. I'm telling you that, honestly." He wasn't sure either. He was only sure that the past 10 days had felt more like a life he wanted to be living than any 10 days he could remember, and that the woman beside him, whoever she was, however she'd come to be here, had something to do with that. "Okay," he said. Same word as October, with an entirely different weight. She finally turned to look at him. This time, the smile reached all the way. What grew between them over the following months was real. Kit knew this the way you know things that aren't convenient to know, gradually, quietly, without wanting to examine them too closely, because examining them might require a response you're not ready for. They fell into the rhythms of a relationship that hadn't been planned. They went to gallery openings in the Pearl District and argued about whether abstraction was discipline or evasion. They cooked together on Sunday afternoons in Kit's kitchen, him with a recipe and her ignoring it, the results almost always better her way. They disagreed about films, agreed about food, had the same response to bad architecture, a shared silence like two musicians who recognize a wrong note. He showed her the drafting room at the Beaton firm on a Saturday afternoon in November, when the office was empty and the winter light came through the north-facing windows in long, clean panels. He showed her his grandfather's original blueprints, kept in a cedar portfolio that still carried the faint smell of the studio it had lived in for 30 years. He showed her the notations in Gerald's hand, small, precise pencil marks in the margins that explained decisions no client had ever needed, explained because the building explained them better. "He thought in the margins," Odessa said, turning one of the blueprints carefully in her hands. "That's exactly right," Kit said. He'd never heard anyone put it that way before. She listened to him talk about the tension between structure and environment, about how the best buildings don't impose on a site but respond to it, engage with it, concede to it in the right places, with the focused attention of someone who found the conversation genuinely interesting rather than politely tolerable. She asked questions that revealed she'd been listening to previous conversations. She remembered things he thought he'd said in passing. In return, she told him about her work. She was a business development consultant, she said. She worked primarily with companies in the construction and real estate sector, helping them evaluate acquisition targets, assess growth strategies, and identify market positioning. She was incisive and efficient and knew how to talk to rooms full of men who had underestimated her exactly once. She was good at her job, in the way that comes from being genuinely interested in the mechanics of it. He admired all of it. He was proud of her in the uncomplicated way you're proud of people whose intelligence you respect. He told his friends she was remarkable. He told his parents she was someone he hadn't expected to find. He admired all of it, and he never looked too carefully at any of the specifics. The first small thing he almost noticed was, in January, 4 months into whatever this had become, they were at his parents' house for Sunday dinner, a regular occurrence now, accepted as expected. The kind of thing that happens when a relationship has graduated from temporary to real in the eyes of everyone who matters. And his father mentioned, in the offhand way he mentioned business things over dinner, that someone had been quietly buying up parcels of commercial real estate in the East Side corridor. "Whoever's behind it has been careful," his father said. refilling his glass. The ownership traces through multiple holding companies. Could be a developer positioning for the rezoning, could be a speculator. Martin thinks the rezoning's the play. Odessa, seated across the table from Kit, looked up from her plate with the easy curiosity she brought to most conversations. What's the rezoning timeline? His father, who always appreciated an intelligent question, answered fully. City Council vote in April. If it passes and the current council is favorable, the corridor becomes eligible for mixed-use development at much higher density. Any firm already positioned there has a significant first-mover advantage. Odessa nodded, thoughtful, absorbing this. And Beaton hasn't moved on any of those parcels? We're architects, not developers, his father said, with a small, amused smile. We want to design what gets built there, not own the land. That's a different business. Of course, Odessa said. She smiled and turned the conversation to the wine, warmly, naturally, with no visible seam. Kit registered the exchange in the way you register a shadow at the edge of your vision. Present noted, not quite worth turning your head for. He didn't turn his head. The second small thing came in March. He was looking for a laptop charger in Odessa's home office. She'd told him it was in the top left drawer, and instead of the charger, he found a slim folder of printed documents. He wouldn't have thought anything of it. She worked in business development. Folders of documents were a professional inevitability, except that the letterhead on the top page was familiar. Blue Peak Capital Group. He knew that name because his father had mentioned it 3 weeks earlier as one of the entities their legal counsel had traced in the East Side ownership structure. He stood in her office for a moment, then closed the drawer. He told himself it was nothing. She worked in real estate development consulting. Of course, she had documents from real estate investment firms. The overlap was coincidental. It meant nothing. He believed that. He chose to believe it, which is not the same thing at all. The call came on a Thursday evening in the first week of April, 10 days before the city council vote. Kit was at the drafting table in his home studio, working on a revision for the Lake Oswego project when his father rang. Can you come in tomorrow morning, first thing? His father's voice had the controlled quality it got when he was managing something difficult. Contained, careful, all the emotion pressed flat. I'd rather talk in person. What's happened? He paused, then said. Martin's been doing some digging on the East Side situation. He found something you need to know about. Another pause. Bring a clear head, Kit. Martin Jolly was the firm's long-serving legal counsel, a quiet, methodical man who communicated in declarative sentences and didn't deploy phrases like, bring a clear head, without specific reason. Kit drove to the office the next morning and sat in his father's office with the door closed, the city spread out in the windows behind his father's desk, and he listened while Martin Jolly laid out what he'd found. Martin did it the way lawyers do, systematically, without drama, without editorializing, following the chain of evidence from link to link in a way that was somehow worse than if he'd led with the conclusion. The primary acquiring entity in the East Side corridor, Martin said, traces through 3 holding companies, 2 registered in Delaware, 1 in the Cayman Islands to a parent fund called Ziller Capital, incorporated in Washington State 8 years ago. The name moved through Kit's chest like cold water. Ziller, he said. The word came out flat. Henry Ziller, based in Seattle, real estate development and investment. He has 2 adult children, a son, who manages West Coast operations, and a daughter. Martin slid a printed page across the desk. On it was a photograph of Odessa Ziller, Senior Business Development Associate, Ziller Capital, until 3 weeks ago. The silence in the room had weight. Kit looked at the photograph. It was a professional headshot, a few years old, her hair slightly longer than he knew it now. The same eyes, the same composed expression. 3 weeks ago, he repeated. She appears to have resigned. We're still working on the details of that. What are they doing? Kit asked. Ziller Capital. What's the actual strategy? Martin folded his hands on the desk. 2 components. The first is the land play, the East Side parcels. At current density limits, they carry a combined value of approximately $9 million. Post-rezoning, with mixed-use eligibility, that rises to somewhere between $38 and $42 million. Standard arbitrage. And the second component? Ziller Capital's development model isn't purely financial. They don't just want to own the land, they want to develop it vertically, meaning they want to control the entire value chain from land acquisition through design, through construction management. To do that, they need an established Pacific Northwest architectural firm as their design partner, preferably through acquisition, which gives them the design reputation, the client relationships, and the city planning relationships simultaneously. He paused. We're one of 2 firms they've been targeting. Kit's father, who had been very still throughout this, said carefully, We haven't had any formal contact from a Ziller Capital. Correct. The approach has been designed to avoid triggering formal protocols. What they've been doing instead is information gathering, assessing financial exposure, key personnel dependencies, client concentration, anything that would inform either a negotiated acquisition approach or, if that fails, a more adversarial one. Martin looked at Kit. Given the information access that a close personal relationship with a senior family member would provide, that approach is considerably more efficient than conventional due diligence. Kit sat very still. He was going back. He was in a coffee shop on a Wednesday in October, and a woman was sitting down across from him uninvited. She was looking at him with those precise camera eyes, and she was saying, "What if I helped you?" She already knew his name. She'd known it before she sat down. He was at his parents' dinner table in January. She was asking about rezoning timelines, and his father was answering while she was listening, in the careful way that people listen when they are not merely interested, but collecting. He was standing in her office holding a folder with a letterhead he recognized and choosing to close the drawer. "How much does she know?" he asked. "We can't quantify it precisely," Martin said, "but given her access over the past 6 months, family dinners, firm visits, conversations about operations and market positioning, the exposure is potentially meaningful." Kit stood up from the chair. He didn't say anything else. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and walked to the door. "Kit," his father said. He stopped. "I'm sorry," his father said, and meant it. He also didn't know what else to say, which was rare for Edward Beaton, and somehow said more than anything else could have. Kit nodded, once then walked out. He didn't call. He drove to her apartment in the northeast of the city because some conversations need to happen in person, and because he needed to see her face. She opened the door, and something in his expression told her everything because her own face shifted in the moment before she could arrange it. Not to guilt exactly, to something more like bracing, the controlled stillness of someone who has been waiting for an impact they knew was coming and has decided to meet it standing. "Kit, were you working?" he asked. His voice was very quiet, much quieter than he'd expected it to be. From the beginning, from that first day in the coffee shop, was any of it not the job? She stepped back from the door, and he walked in. She didn't ask how he'd found out. She didn't reach for a denial. Both of those things registered with him later when he had the distance to analyze it. In the moment, he was simply watching her. "Sit down," she said. "I don't want to sit down." "Okay." She sat herself on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped between her knees. She looked at him and didn't look away. "Yes." The coffee shop was deliberate. "I'd been watching the firm for 2 weeks. I knew who you were before I sat down. I saw an opportunity, and I took it." He'd known it was true. He'd known it from the moment Martin said her name, and still, hearing her say it out loud was like the floor deciding it was done holding him up. "The family pressure story," he said. "Your parents, all of that. True. My parents are genuinely on my case about my personal life. That part wasn't invented. It just wasn't the reason I sat down." What was the reason? It wasn't a question he already knew. He wanted to hear her say it. She held his gaze. Proximity. Access. Information that would flow naturally through a family relationship in ways it never would through formal channels. "Your father talks about firm strategy over Sunday dinner because he trusts the people at the table. He wouldn't say those things to a competitor's representative. But to his son's girlfriend, who asks thoughtful questions and clearly has good instincts about business? Yes, he would." Kit heard himself make a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "Naturally," he said. The word felt bitter in his mouth. "Kit, I know how this sounds." "No." The word was flat. "You don't get to tell me what you know right now. You sat at my grandmother's table. You spent 10 days with her. You held her umbrella in the Japanese garden, and you listened to her talk about my grandfather for 2 hours. And the whole time, you were working. You know what she said to me after that first dinner? She said you were lovely, that you had a spine." He paused. "She doesn't say things like that. She doesn't give that to people. She gave it to you." Something moved in Odessa's face, something that was not composed or controlled and had not been prepared. "What about the last 2 months?" Kit asked. "The rezoning vote is next week. You already have what you needed. Why are you still here?" The longest pause of everything. "Because I didn't want to leave," she said, very quiet. "That isn't a calculation. I don't know how to explain it in a way that isn't going to sound like exactly what you expect a person in my position to say. But it's true. How am I supposed to believe anything you say to me?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked at her hands, then she looked up. "You're not. I don't have the right to ask you to. I'm telling you because you asked, not because I expected to do anything." He stood in her apartment and looked at her, at the woman he'd loved and the stranger he'd apparently never met, both of them existing in the same person, the same face, the same eyes that had always processed things too fast for him to keep up with. He had nothing left to say that wouldn't be less than what he was feeling. He walked out and drove home through the rain. He sat in his car in the driveway for a long time, without going inside, listening to the rain on the roof, which didn't help. The days after that moved slowly and badly. Kit went to work because going to work was better than staying home with too much time to think. He sat at his drafting table and looked at lines that were supposed to become buildings. He found that the connection between what he drew and why it mattered had temporarily severed. His mother called. He told her a version of the truth that spared the worst details. His father, when Kit came to the office, said very little about any of it, which, with Edward Beaton, was a form of grace. It was Nana Beu who called on the fourth day from Sedona, with the directness that 83 years of life had only refined. "Your mother tells me there's trouble with Odessa." "Yes, Nan. Is it her fault or yours?" Despite everything, he almost smiled. "Hers. This time it's hers." A long pause. Nana B's pauses had always been their own form of communication. "I want you to know something, Christopher. I've been reading people for 83 years. I wasn't wrong about her. She was deceiving us, Nan." "I didn't say she wasn't. I said I wasn't wrong about her. There are people who like you and people who use you, and there are people who started out using you and found they couldn't stop liking you. That last category is more complicated than the other two." A pause. "She wasn't pretending to like me. The affection was real. I know the difference. She was working for a company that was trying to acquire our firm." "Yes, and apparently she stopped." Nana B paused. "I'm not telling you what to do with that. I'm telling you what I saw." She said goodbye and hung up, because she was Nana B and she had never believed in prolonging a conversation past its useful point. Kit put down the phone, looked at the window, and thought about architecture, about how the integrity of a structure depends on every element being exactly what it presents itself as. A beam that appears load-bearing but doesn't merely fail to hold weight. It creates a catastrophic dependency. You build on it, you trust it. And by the time the failure comes, too much else is contingent on it to survive the collapse. He thought about which parts of Odessa had been load-bearing. The answer was messier than he wanted it to be. The city council vote came in April, and the rezoning passed. Ziller Capital's east side position increased in value by roughly $31 million. Beaton Architectural Group received a formal written acquisition approach from Ziller Capital the following week, professionally structured, accompanied by a valuation that Martin assessed as 3 points below fair market. Martin rejected it in writing, with a counterposition that made clear the firm had been tracking the situation carefully and was not interested in a transaction at any price the Zillers were likely to offer. Odessa's name appeared nowhere in the acquisition documents. She was, officially, no longer an employee. 2 weeks after that, Kit received a handwritten letter. The envelope had no return address, but he recognized the handwriting from a grocery list she'd once left on his kitchen counter, back when she'd still left things at his place. She had precise architectural handwriting, small and clear, each letter given its full space. The letter was 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged what she'd done without euphemism, without softening language, without the passive voice that people use when they want to describe their actions without quite owning them. The second said that the feelings she'd expressed on the porch in October had been real and had grown in ways she hadn't anticipated, and that this didn't absolve her of anything, and she wasn't presenting it as though it did. The third said she had resigned from Ziller Capital. It didn't explain further. It didn't ask him for anything. He read it 3 times, then put it inside the cedar portfolio, where his grandfather's original blueprints lived. He wasn't sure why. Some things you keep not because you've resolved them, but because you haven't yet. And keeping them is a way of leaving the door open to a resolution you can't quite see yet. This part of the story Kit only learned in pieces later, from a mutual acquaintance neither of them had planned on. Odessa Ziller had worked for her father's company since she was 26 years old. She was very good at it. Henry Ziller was the kind of father who expressed love primarily through deployment, who sent you into difficult situations because he trusted your competence, and whose trust felt like the highest form of approval available. Odessa had been conditioned since childhood to value that approval above most other things. She had executed the Beaton assignment without hesitation. She was good at her job. That was the point. What she hadn't factored in was Nana Bia. She told this to a friend in Seattle months later over dinner, trying to explain something she didn't fully understand herself. "She looked at me like she could see past whatever I was presenting," Odessa said. "And she was kind anyway. Not naive kind or oblivious kind, the kind that sees something in you and decides it's worth being generous with. And I didn't deserve it. I knew I didn't deserve it, and I kept showing up and taking it anyway. And every time I did that, it got heavier." She had not made a single clean decision to stop being who she'd been. It was more gradual, more uncomfortable than that. A slow accumulation. The weight of sitting across from Kit and watching something uncomplicated and genuine move across his face, and knowing she was holding a card he didn't know existed. The weight of Nana B in the garden. The the weight of Sunday dinners with people who trusted her because their son did, and who would not have if they'd known the truth. The weight became too much somewhere around March. She couldn't have named the specific day. It wasn't a revelation so much as a gradual inability to continue carrying it without collapsing under it. After Kit left her apartment, she sat without moving for a long time. Then she called her father. "I'm done," she said when he answered. "Done with what, specifically?" Her father's voice was measured. He was always measured. All of it. The beaten approach, the East Side strategy, my role in it. Was a long silence. "Odessa, we're 10 days from the vote. I know exactly when the vote is. I'm telling you, I'm done." Another silence, longer. "This is about the beaten situation becoming personal. This is about me," she said. "It's about who I am when I'm doing this kind of work, and I'm done with who that is." She submitted her resignation the following morning. She didn't negotiate a package. She didn't stage it or time it for advantage. She walked out of Ziller Capital with a box of personal effects and the specific lightness that comes not from happiness, but from having stopped doing something that was making you someone you didn't recognize. She was not redeemed by this. She understood that clearly, in the way that honest people understand things they wish were otherwise. Resignation is not restitution. Walking away from a wrong you've already completed doesn't uncomplete it. She had used Kit. She had gathered intelligence from his family's dinner table. She had sat in the Japanese garden under Nana Bay's umbrella and filed reports. Those things had happened. But she was done participating in the version of herself who did those things. That was something she could control. It was the only thing she currently had. She moved to Portland not to find Kit. She was clear-eyed enough about her own guilt not to mistake it for a romantic gesture. She moved because Portland was where the thing she'd been trying to outrun had happened to her, and she had decided to stop running and instead live in the proximity of the decision and what it cost. She took a position with a small nonprofit that provided strategic consulting to independent architecture and construction firms. Small practices, family-run firms, exactly the kind of businesses that acquisition-focused funds like Ziller Capital identified as targets. The irony was architectural in its precision. She suspected it was also entirely intentional in the way that the decisions we make when we're trying to become better versions of ourselves are often a form of corrective architecture. Kit didn't call Odessa. He didn't drive by her apartment, nor did he follow digital threads or ask mutual connections about her. He left that door closed because he wasn't ready to know what was behind it, and he'd learned something from October. Wanting an answer you're not ready for isn't a good enough reason to go looking for it. He drew. Not for clients or deadlines. He filled 2 sketchbooks in the spring and summer with structures that had no practical purpose. Buildings designed for no site, for no client, for no function except to be imagined fully. He'd done this as a student when drawing was still exploration rather than obligation, and he'd stopped when the firm took up the space where exploration used to live. He started again and found it necessary in the specific way that clearing your throat is necessary before you can speak clearly. He went on 2 dates in September. Both women were interesting and perceptive and deserved better than a man who was physically present and otherwise somewhere else entirely. He knew this, and they probably knew it. He called it off both times before it became unfair. He told his mother in November, "I'm working something out." "I know," his mother said. "Take the time you need." What he was working out didn't have a clean name. It was somewhere between grief and inventory, a reckoning not just with what Odessa had done, but with what he'd chosen not to see and why. He wasn't a naive person. He'd been trained since childhood to look at structures and identify flaws before they became failures. He had noticed the pauses and the shadows and the familiar letterheads, and he had chosen not to turn toward them because turning toward them might have disrupted something he wanted. His desire for the arrangement to be clean had made him complicit in its not being clean. That was his accounting. It didn't make Odessa's actions forgivable. It made him honest about his own role in what had happened. He saw her once by accident in February in a coffee shop on Burnside. Not the same one as October, a different one, but close enough that the symmetry felt intentional in the way that only coincidences do. She was at a window table with a laptop and a cup of tea. She looked up when he came through the door, and both of them went very still. He ordered his coffee and stood at the counter waiting for it. After a moment, she crossed the room and stood beside him at a careful distance. Not close, not distant. The considered space of someone who understands they've lost the right to closeness and isn't claiming it. "I heard you kept the firm," she said. "We did. I'm glad. I work with independent firms now, small ones, helping them protect their positioning." She said it simply, without decoration, not as a performance of redemption, just a fact. He picked up his coffee when it came and looked at her. She looked back. She didn't reach for more than what they currently were, which was 2 people standing in a coffee shop in February, a year away from where it had started, with too much between them for easy resolution and too much that had been real to dismiss entirely. "Take care of yourself, Odessa," he said. "You too." He walked out into the February morning and stood on the pavement for a moment with his coffee and the gray Portland sky above him and the street going about its regular business all around him. He felt the shape of something he couldn't quite name yet, something like the first draft of a foundation, rough, unfinished, but level. He walked to his car, then drove to the office. He sat at his drafting table and drew the first line of something new. Before we get to the advice part of today's story, I want to sit with what just happened for a moment, because this one is more layered than most betrayal stories are. Odessa was the villain. She targeted Kit. She cultivated access to his family under false pretenses, gathered intelligence for a business operation, and caused real harm to people who trusted her. And all of that is true. But the story underneath that story is this: two people entered a relationship under false pretenses. His a harmless improvisation born of family pressure, hers a calculated strategic operation, and somewhere in the middle of what they'd each scripted, something happened that neither of them had written. And the tragedy isn't just that she betrayed him, it's that she kept going after she'd stopped wanting to. We don't have a good word for that particular moral paralysis. When you know you're doing wrong, and the knowing is not yet strong enough to overcome the momentum of what you've already set in motion. Odessa lived in that space for months. Every day she stayed was another day she chose not to stop. The cost of those days, the relationship, the career, the version of herself she'd been comfortable inhabiting, was, in the end, exactly proportional to what she'd built there. And Kit's lesson is quieter, but no less real. The capacity to choose not to look at what you don't want to see is not innocence. It's a decision made in the service of comfort, and the things you don't look at don't go away. They simply accumulate without your supervision. Here is what the story of Kit and Odessa teaches us, and I want to talk about this practically because I think it matters beyond the story. When something arrives that fits your problem too perfectly, pause. Desperation makes us want clean solutions. And people who want to exploit us are very good at presenting themselves as exactly that. It doesn't mean every coincidence is a trap. It means that when the answer appears at just the right moment, with just the right shape, it's worth asking a few more questions before you shake hands and call it a deal. Information is currency even when it doesn't feel like it. The Beatons talked about firm strategy and market positioning at Sunday dinner because it was natural and because they trusted the people at the table. That same information, in the wrong hands, was leverage. Be thoughtful about who has access to your inner circle before they've fully earned that access. This doesn't mean treating everyone like a suspect. It means recognizing that trust, extended too quickly, is a gift that not everyone has the character to handle well. Your peripheral vision is trying to help you. The things you almost notice, the half-second pause, the question that went slightly too deep, the familiar name on a document you weren't supposed to see, these are your perceptions doing their job. They don't always mean something serious, but they're worth turning toward, especially when turning toward them is uncomfortable. Discomfort is often the signal that something real is there. Real feeling doesn't cancel wrongdoing. The fact that Odessa eventually felt genuine love for Kit did not undo the damage, did not give her an automatic claim on forgiveness, and did not mean she was entitled to a second chance. Real emotion is not the same as integrity. You can love someone and have harmed them. You can be loved by someone and still be right to walk away. Both of those things can be true simultaneously. And perhaps most importantly, what you build after a betrayal doesn't have to look like what came before. You can't unknow what you now know. You can't return to the version of yourself who didn't know it. But that's not necessarily a loss. The self that exists after you've survived something difficult and done the reckoning honestly, that self knows more. It can build better. It just has to be willing to start from what's actually there, rather than from what it wishes were there. Kit Beaton drew a first line in February. That's where we leave him. Not healed, not whole, not over it, but beginning, which is honestly the only place any of us ever really starts from. Odessa Ziller chose to stop being the person she'd been in the service of other people's agendas. She's still working out who she is on the other side of that choice. That work is going to take time, and it should. The things we do in the service of our worst instincts don't resolve quickly, and anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something. But here is what I know. Both of them are still drawing, still designing, still believing, somewhere in the load-bearing parts of who they are, that it's possible to build something honest from whatever materials are left. That might be enough. It might have to be. If this story moved you, if it shook something loose, if it made you look a little harder at your own foundations, you're not alone. Every story we tell here lives in the space between what we planned and what actually happened. Subscribe to our channel and join a community that understands what it means to love something, lose it, and find the courage to start again. Hit that subscribe button. We'll be right here. Take care, and God bless.